Okay, so I'm going to end with two stories to do with SpaceX. The first one was about 2 weeks ago on the 11th of April. We had the second launch of the Falcon Heavy rocket, which is right now the largest, most capable rocket on Earth. It has about 5 million pounds of thrust on takeoff. It's about 240 feet tall. And so it was carrying, I think it was about a 20,000 pound communication satellite. And so I'm going to speed through this, but here's a video of the
15 seconds.
Of the launch, and then we'll speed up to where
8, 7,
other fun
6,
stuff starts to happen.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition. Liftoff.
Vehicles mission downrange.
And we're beginning deep throttle.
So this is the speedometer in miles per hour, and you can see how rapidly it's accelerating. So I'm going to fast forward to somewhere close to where the
of the two side boosters.
So this is looking from the nose down. Here's the two side strap-on boosters, and then this is looking at the center. And so at about 3 minutes or so into the flight, the side boosters, I'm sorry, 2.5 minutes, the side boosters fall away. The center core keeps firing. And then at about 3 minutes, 3.5 minutes, the first stage falls away. And you see that happening in the distance there. And then the second stage ignites and carries the payload into the appropriate orbit. But then the fun stuff starts happening.
Entry burn is complete for the side boosters.
Stage 1, entry burn is started.
So the two side boosters
Coming up in about 5 seconds
thrust
here, the side boosters
themselves
landing
back
burn will
towards
begin as well.
Cape Canaveral, and they land on concrete landing pads. And so look at the top two screens. How fun is that? So then to cut to the chase, the center booster, when it fell away, it lands on a sort of a football field sized drone ship several hundred miles off the coast.
15 seconds will be the center core landing burn beginning.
That succeeded as well. And I'm going
again,
to
as we mentioned
cut
earlier,
through this
is going
just
to be
so
a
we can
landing.
finish in less than
And we are
an hour
landing on
here.
our drone ship. Of course, I still love you.
So just a couple of really cool still images of this happening. So there's the launch. There's a close-up view of all 27 engines firing on that first stage. And then this is a view of the two side boosters coming down. And then there's the center one out in the Atlantic Ocean. So this was the first time they've recovered all three. The first launch about a year ago, this one ended up running out of starter propellant or starter fuel to reignite the engines to slow down, and it crashed just off the drone ship going about 800 miles an hour. And it caused such an explosion when it hit the surface of the ocean. It heavily damaged the ship, even though it didn't actually touch it directly. But again, cutting to the chase here, after they landed, the seas started getting very rough, and they had 10 to 12 foot waves, and the core actually fell over. They hadn't been able to secure it at that point, and the top half of it snapped off and fell into the ocean. The bottom half is pretty dented up, but it did stay on board the drone ship, and they've brought that back just to examine it. And so it was mostly a success. I mean, the payload made it to orbit. That's the important thing. And they recovered 2 out of 3 of the boosters. And so then the other thing, and I think Naomi talked about this last month, is in March, we had the first flight of the Crew Dragon vehicle, which is also built by SpaceX. And this is a commercial program to act as a taxi for astronauts to and from the space station. NASA has issued contracts with both SpaceX and Boeing to provide this service. They're just now entering flight tests. And so this is the capsule that could hold up to 7 people if they crowded it. Typically it's going to be 3 or 4. And this was on top of the Falcon 9 rocket. Here's the walkway that the astronauts will ultimately use to get out to the spacecraft. And here it was the night before launch. And then on the 2nd of March is when it took off. A day later, it docked with the space station, and it stayed docked for about a week. They came back on the 10th of March, landed under parachutes in the Atlantic off of Cape Canaveral, and were picked up by a ship and carried back to shore. So this would be the astronauts would ride this down and stay on board until they get plucked out of the water. And I certainly hope they have super doses of Dramamine, because it's got to be really exciting when you're coming back from 6 months of zero gravity and you're suddenly in a wavy ocean. But just to get a feel for it, this is what that spacecraft looked like having done a round trip. And so most of the charring you see is from the reentry heating. And so the next step, before they certify this to have astronauts on board, it's called human rating it, is they have to prove that their escape system will work. And so they have, this is one of 4. There's 4 sets of, they're called Super Draco engines that each produce about 18,000 pounds of thrust, and they can ramp up in thrust virtually instantaneously. And if a problem happens on the launch pad after the crew is on board, or the rocket blows up at some point during the launch, they fire those engines, it carries the spacecraft away from whatever the problem is, and then it comes down on its parachutes. And so in 2015, they did the first test of that, and this was from a pad in Florida. I'm sorry, this was at Wallops Island in Virginia. And so that was the Crew Dragon, getting out of town from the launch pad, and then it successfully came down on its parachutes. So the next test, and they were hoping to use that spacecraft that just flew to and from the space station, that's their sacrificial lamb, and they were going to do a launch abort test where they put it on a Falcon 9 rocket. After about a minute of flight, it's called maximum aerodynamic pressure, maximum dynamic pressure. It's where the drag of the atmosphere is the most extreme. And so it's the most difficult spot that you could try to separate the spacecraft from the rocket. And this is just an artist view of that starting, and then the next step would be the rocket will fall away, likely be destroyed, and the capsule, the Crew Dragon capsule, will come down in the ocean under its parachutes. So last Saturday, they were doing a test of the sort of a static firing test of the abort engines, those Super Draco engines. So it was on a platform at near the landing sites for the Falcon rockets. And well, I'm sorry, I'm ahead of myself again. So the launch abort test tentatively was scheduled for July of this year. And then assuming that was successful, the next mission would carry 2 astronauts to the space station. And that likely was going to be September, October, November-ish. And so these are the Bob Behnken and Rich Hurley. And so that's the crew that's waiting in the wings to fly one of these. And so what they were trying to do was test the engines without the capsule going anywhere. And so it's sort of tied down to the ground. And just a tour bus on Cape Canaveral saw this orange plume of smoke off in the distance. Some surfers in Cocoa Beach saw the same thing. And this is a pirated video, or I'm sorry, let me explain what this is before anything happens here. So the word came out within a few hours that SpaceX said, we've had an anomaly in our test. That's all they said, essentially. And then by late that evening, Saturday evening, early Sunday, somebody that was in the control room had taken a cell phone video of a TV monitor that was showing the test. And so this next video is what got sort of put out there. It was very quickly withdrawn from Twitter, but once it was out there, it got copied and it essentially went viral. So here's that video of the anomaly. There's the this is the test stand holding it down. There's the rocket, or the capsule, and it essentially blew itself apart. And if you go looking for this on the web, if you have small children, you might want to put your hands over their ears, because there's some relatively strong language in the background that you can imagine. But at this point, that's what we know, is the spacecraft was destroyed. And they're trying to figure out, of course, what did this and make sure that it doesn't happen again. The one thing that lots of engineers that have worked on systems like this are saying is this could either be one of the Draco engines, which are housed in here. Something happened to that and it blew up and it impacted the tanks that have the fuel and the oxidizer, or the tanks themselves ruptured. And the material they use for fuel is nitrogen tetroxide and hydrazine, and it's called hypergolic propellant. When those two materials touch, they explode, and that's what makes the rocket go off. And so even a leak in the plumbing could be enough to do that. And so this is a view of that spacecraft being assembled. These red tanks here are where the hydrazine and nitrogen tetroxide are housed, and they're under high pressure. So they have their work cut out for them. But obviously that flight in July, June will not be happening because they don't have a spacecraft to do it with. And there's really been very little detail released so far, other than that there was a problem. Nobody was hurt. This is what tests like this are all about, is find out these problems before you have people on board. Or, I mean, the worst case scenario that was talked about is one of these things is docked to the ISS and you have people on board and you've got a crew on the ISS, and it's obviously a very energetic event. So they will have to figure out what that problem is and correct it before they're flying any astronauts to the ISS. So that's going to slow things down. But waiting in the wings is Boeing. They're hoping for their first unmanned flight test to happen in August-ish, and that's one of the reasons why NASA chose two very different designs for the commercial crew vehicles. So if there is a problem with one, presumably it's not going to affect the other design as well.